I want you to be fully present for what I am about to explain, because this is something that many men misunderstand for most of their lives and only realize too late when they have already spent years operating under the wrong assumptions. In clinical practice and in years of observing human behavior, one pattern becomes very clear. Men over 60 often begin to question something deeply personal. They look at themselves in the mirror and quietly wonder whether their most attractive years are behind them, whether the kind of attention, desire, and emotional pull they once experienced has now faded simply because of age. And I need to address this directly, because the belief that attractiveness naturally disappears with age is not just incomplete, it is scientifically and psychologically misleading. There is a cultural narrative that constantly reinforces youth as the peak of desirability. It is reinforced through media, advertising, and social comparison. It teaches men that once gray hair appears, once the body changes, once the energy shifts, their influence and attraction diminishes. But when we actually study human psychology, particularly female attraction patterns across different age groups, the reality is far more complex and far more encouraging for men who have lived long enough to develop depth. Female attraction, in its more stable and long-term form, is not primarily driven by physical appearance alone. That is a surface-level assumption that many men carry for decades. They believe that youthfulness, muscle tone, or facial symmetry are the main drivers of desire. So naturally, when they age, they assume they are losing ground. But what research and behavioral observation consistently show is something different. Sustained attraction in women is far more closely linked to internal traits rather than external appearance. Traits that are not only independent of age, but in many cases strengthened by it when a man has lived consciously. These include emotional stability, psychological presence, a grounded sense of identity, and what I would describe clinically as internal coherence. This is the alignment between what a man believes, how he behaves, and how he carries himself in the world. A man who has lived through challenges, losses, relationships, responsibilities, and personal growth has the potential to develop something that younger men simply have not had enough time to build. And that is perspective. Not abstract perspective, but lived, embodied understanding of life, relationships, and self-awareness. However, the key distinction is this. Age alone does not automatically create attractiveness. It is not the number of years that matters. It is what a man has done with those years internally. Two men can be the same age, yet present completely different levels of presence and attractiveness. One may carry frustration, resistance to change, and emotional rigidity. The other may carry calm, depth, and a quiet confidence that does not need validation. From a psychological standpoint, women tend to respond strongly to the second type, not because it is performed, but because it is felt. Human nervous systems are constantly reading subtle cues of emotional safety, stability, and predictability. This is not conscious thinking. It is automatic processing at a biological level. When a woman is in the presence of a man who is internally grounded, whose emotional reactions are not erratic, and whose presence feels stable rather than uncertain, her stress response system naturally begins to settle. This is an important physiological shift, because attraction does not begin with excitement. It begins with safety. And this is where most men over 60 misinterpret their own position. They assume they need to compete with younger men by trying to appear younger, act younger, or suppress the very life experience that actually creates depth. In doing so, they often abandon the very qualities that could make them most attractive. They begin minimizing their age instead of integrating it. They try to replicate communication styles, behaviors, and social energy that belong to a different stage of life. And in that process, they disconnect from their most powerful asset, which is who they have actually become. The reality is, a man who has lived fully, who has experienced success and failure, connection and loss, certainty and confusion, carries something that cannot be manufactured quickly. That something is psychological weight. Not heaviness in a negative sense, but substance, a sense that this person has been through life and is still standing with clarity. When this is combined with emotional awareness and self-acceptance, it produces what we can begin to define as embodied certainty. And this is where everything begins to shift. Embodied certainty is not about dominance. It is not about loud confidence or social performance. It is a quiet internal state where a man no longer feels the need to prove his identity. He is not negotiating his worth in every interaction. He is not seeking validation through constant explanation or overcompensation. Instead, he is settled in himself. You can observe this in subtle ways. The pace of his speech, the absence of urgency in his movements, the way he enters a room without trying to adjust its energy, the way he listens without preparing his response while the other person is still speaking, the way he pauses without fear of silence. From a physiological perspective, this presence has a direct effect on the nervous system of the person he is interacting with. When the brain detects stability and consistency, it reduces its vigilance. That reduction in vigilance is what allows emotional openness to emerge. And emotional openness is one of the foundational conditions for attraction to develop in a deeper sense. But before we go further into that, it is important to recognize something clearly. Many men over 60 possess this quality already, but they do not recognize it as valuable. In fact, they often suppress it. They downplay their age, their experience, and their perspective because they assume those qualities make them less relevant. In reality, those are precisely the qualities that, when fully embodied, create the strongest form of presence. So the real question is not whether attractiveness disappears with age. The real question is whether a man has learned to inhabit who he has become, or whether he is still trying to negotiate with who he used to be. Continuing from this foundation, we now need to go deeper into what actually sustains attraction beyond first impressions, because this is where most misunderstandings happen for men over 60. When a man carries embodied certainty, as we discussed, it creates a form of internal stability that is immediately sensed by others, even if they cannot consciously explain why. But attraction is not built on a single trait. It is built on a combination of internal qualities that interact with one another in subtle but powerful ways. And one of the most important of these is emotional availability. Now, emotional availability is often misunderstood, especially among men who grew up in environments where emotional restraint was seen as strength. Many were taught that expressing emotion openly was unnecessary, or even a sign of weakness. Over time, this creates a pattern where emotional life becomes internalized, controlled, or redirected into silence. But in the context of long-term human connection, especially in later stages of life, this becomes a limitation rather than a strength. Because emotional availability is not about emotional excess. It is not about constant expression or oversharing. It is about accessibility. It is the ability to remain connected to one's internal emotional world and allow that world to be seen without distortion, denial, or defensive filtering. From a psychological perspective, this is one of the most significant factors in relational depth. When a person is emotionally available, they are essentially signaling that they are safe to connect with at a deeper level because they are not hiding from themselves. And this has a very specific effect in interpersonal dynamics. When a woman interacts with a man who is emotionally closed, unpredictable, or defensive, her cognitive and emotional systems remain partially on alert. There is an unconscious monitoring process happening in the background. She is trying to interpret what is safe, what is not being said, and what emotional reactions might emerge unexpectedly. This creates distance, even if conversation is pleasant on the surface. But when the man is emotionally available, something important changes. There is no need for constant interpretation. There is no hidden emotional landscape that needs to be decoded. What is expressed aligns with what is felt. This creates psychological ease. And psychological ease is one of the strongest preconditions for attraction to deepen over time. Now, it is important to clarify something here. Emotional availability does not mean emotional dependency. It does not mean a man becomes reactive, unstable, or overly expressive. In fact, the most attractive form of emotional availability is grounded and controlled. It is the ability to say, calmly and directly, what one feels, without exaggeration and without suppression. For example, a man who can acknowledge disappointment without turning it into blame. A man who can recognize regret without collapsing into self-criticism. A man who can express appreciation without hesitation or awkward restraint. These are all expressions of emotional maturity. And this level of maturity is not something that is lost with age. It is something that, in many cases, becomes more refined when a man has done the internal work of reflecting on his life experiences. However, the challenge is that many men do not develop this refinement. Instead, they harden emotionally over time. Experiences that could have created openness instead create protection. Instead of becoming more flexible internally, they become more rigid. This is not a moral judgment. It is a psychological adaptation. When people experience emotional pain without processing it, the nervous system often learns to reduce exposure to similar situations in the future. That reduction in exposure can look like emotional withdrawal. But the cost of that withdrawal is significant in terms of connection. Because emotional withdrawal limits depth. And depth is what women tend to respond to in later stages of attraction, especially in relationships that are not based on novelty, but on genuine connection. Now, let us be very precise here. Women are not simply looking for emotional expression. They are looking for emotional coherence. There is a difference. Emotional expression without stability feels chaotic. Emotional suppression feels distant. But emotional coherence, where a man understands what he feels, can articulate it clearly, and does not lose himself in it, creates trust. And trust is one of the most powerful attractors in human psychology. This is why many women in their 40s, 50s, and beyond often respond strongly to men who are not trying to perform emotional intelligence, but who simply possess it through lived experience. Men who can talk about their past honestly, including mistakes, without defensiveness. Men who can acknowledge complexity in relationships without simplifying everything into blame. Men who can stay present in emotionally charged conversations without withdrawing or becoming reactive. These men are not performing sensitivity. They are simply not disconnected from themselves. And that distinction matters because performance can be detected, but presence is felt. From a neurobiological standpoint, emotional availability reduces uncertainty in interaction. And the brain is highly sensitive to uncertainty in social environments. When uncertainty decreases, the body relaxes. And when the body relaxes, emotional openness increases. This is the beginning of real connection. But here is where many men over 60 unintentionally limit themselves. They assume that emotional availability means losing control or giving up authority, so they avoid it entirely. Or they only express it in controlled, selective ways that do not actually reflect their inner reality. In doing so, they miss the opportunity to create depth. And instead, relationships remain at a surface level, even when there is interest or attraction present. What is required instead is integration, the ability to remain grounded while also being emotionally accessible, to hold strength and openness at the same time, not one replacing the other, but both existing together. That is what creates genuine relational depth in later life. Now that we understand emotional availability, we need to move into something that quietly shapes attraction even more strongly over time, yet is often ignored by men completely. And that is purpose. Purpose is not just about having a job, or staying busy, or filling time. In psychological terms, purpose is the sense that a person's life is directed towards something meaningful beyond immediate comfort or routine. It is the internal experience of moving towards something that feels significant, even if it is not always externally rewarded or recognized. For men over 60, this becomes especially important because life often shifts at this stage. Careers may slow down or end, children may be grown, social roles may change, and for many men, this creates a subtle but powerful identity vacuum. What used to define their daily structure is no longer present in the same way. And if that space is not consciously filled with something meaningful, a quiet form of disengagement can begin to develop. This is where attraction is indirectly affected in ways most people never talk about openly. Because when a man loses connection to purpose, he does not just become less active, he becomes less energetically present. His conversations may still be polite, his behavior may still be functional, but something changes in his internal momentum. And human beings, especially in close relational contexts, are extremely sensitive to momentum. Now, let us define this clearly. A man with purpose carries a sense of forward movement. He is not psychologically stagnant. He is engaged with something that extends beyond repetition or obligation. That something could take many forms. It could be intellectual curiosity. It could be creative work. It could be mentoring, community involvement, physical mastery, learning, or even rebuilding parts of his personal life with intention. The specific form matters less than the presence of genuine engagement, because what is being perceived is not the activity itself, but the internal state behind it. When a man is engaged with purpose, his presence feels different. There is direction in his attention. There is energy behind his words. There is a sense that his life is still unfolding rather than simply being maintained. From a psychological standpoint, this creates a very specific response in others. It signals aliveness. And aliveness is one of the most consistently attractive traits in human interaction. Now, it is important to separate purpose from productivity. Many men confuse being busy with being purposeful, but busyness without meaning is simply motion without direction. It does not create the same psychological impact. Purpose requires emotional investment. It requires care. It requires a sense that what one is doing actually matters on a personal level. And when that is present, it becomes visible in subtle ways, in how a man speaks about his day, in the quality of attention he gives to conversation, in the way he thinks about the future, even in small terms. There is a difference between someone who is passing time and someone who is living through time. Women, particularly those who have developed emotional awareness themselves, tend to notice this difference very quickly. And here is a key point that often gets missed. Women are not necessarily looking for a man whose life revolves around them. In fact, in many cases, that can feel overwhelming or unbalanced. What is far more attractive is a man who already has a meaningful life and who chooses to share parts of it. This creates a dynamic of invitation rather than dependency. And psychologically, invitation is far more attractive than need. When a man is driven by need, the interaction carries weight. There is an underlying sense of expectation. The relationship becomes a source of validation or completion. But when a man is driven by purpose, the interaction carries openness. There is space. There is curiosity. There is a sense that connection is something added to a life that already has structure and meaning, not something that is required to make that life function. This shift completely changes relational dynamics. Now, for many men over 60, there is a critical transition point here that needs to be acknowledged honestly. If purpose has been tied only to external roles, such as career identity or family responsibility, then the loss of those roles can feel like a loss of direction itself. This is where some men begin to emotionally withdraw from life without fully realizing it. They may describe it as slowing down, or taking it easy, or simply enjoying retirement. But underneath that language, there can sometimes be a subtle disengagement from growth, curiosity, and forward movement. And over time, this affects not just the man's internal experience, but also how others respond to him emotionally. Because people do not only respond to what a person says, they respond to what a person is energetically connected to. A man who is no longer connected to purpose may still be kind, intelligent, and socially capable. But the sense of direction that once made his presence compelling can begin to fade. The solution is not to return to past roles or recreate earlier versions of identity. The solution is to consciously redefine purpose for the present stage of life. That may sound simple, but psychologically, it requires a shift in self-perception. It requires asking a very direct question. Not what did my life used to be about, but what does my life feel meaningful toward now, in this phase, with this level of experience and awareness? And the answer to that question is deeply individual. There is no universal formula. What matters is that something genuinely matters again. Something that engages attention, curiosity, and emotional investment in the present. Because when that happens, something important returns. Presence becomes active again. An active presence is one of the strongest foundations of attraction, not because it is performed, but because it is felt. At this stage, we need to move into something that is often misunderstood, even more than emotional availability and purpose, yet it plays a major role in how attraction is experienced in real life, and that is physical vitality. Now, I want to be very precise here, because many men immediately misunderstand this point. Physical vitality is not the same as youth. It is not about trying to recreate a younger body, and it is not about competing with younger men in appearance or performance. That is not only unrealistic, it also misses the entire psychological point. Physical vitality is about how a man inhabits his body right now, at his current age, with his current life experience. It is the difference between a man who is physically present in his body and a man who is simply existing inside it. From a behavioral standpoint, vitality is communicated through extremely subtle signals. The way a man moves, the ease or tension in his posture, the steadiness of his eye contact, the rhythm of his walking, even the way he transitions between actions, sitting, standing, turning, speaking, pausing. These details may seem small, but human beings are constantly reading them at a subconscious level. Because the nervous system does not only respond to words, it responds to movement, energy, and physical coherence. When a man moves through the world with ease, with control that is not rigid but natural, it creates a perception of internal stability. When his body appears neglected, stiff, or disconnected, it sends a different signal entirely, not about worth, but about energy and engagement. And women are particularly sensitive to these nonverbal cues, often without consciously analyzing them. Now, let us correct a very common misunderstanding. Vitality does not require perfection. It does not require a sculpted physique or athletic performance. What it requires is engagement. A man who walks regularly, who maintains his strength in a realistic way, who takes care of his sleep, his nutrition, his hygiene, and his general physical presence, is communicating something very important. He is communicating self-respect. And self-respect is immediately recognizable in physical form. Clothing, posture, grooming, and basic physical care are not superficial details. They are signals of how a man relates to himself, whether he considers himself worth maintaining, whether he is still actively participating in his own life. When these elements are present, even without youth, there is a sense of energy that others can feel. Now, from a psychological perspective, vitality also plays a role in emotional perception. A man who is physically engaged tends to be more mentally alert and emotionally responsive. This is not abstract. There is a direct connection between physical state and cognitive emotional presence. A sedentary, disengaged physical lifestyle often correlates with lower energy, reduced initiative, and less emotional expressiveness, whereas a physically active lifestyle supports clarity, responsiveness, and a more stable emotional baseline. This matters in relational dynamics because attraction is not built on one dimension alone. It is built on the integration of multiple signals. Emotional, psychological, and physical coherence all contribute to the overall impression of presence. Now, I want to address something that is often overlooked in discussions about older men and attraction, and that is sexual vitality. This is a subject that is rarely spoken about directly, yet it is central to human connection. Sexual vitality is not defined by performance metrics or comparison to younger stages of life. That is a misunderstanding that creates unnecessary pressure and distortion. Instead, sexual vitality in later life is primarily about presence, attention, and relational awareness. It is about being fully engaged with another person in a way that is not rushed, not mechanical, and not driven by performance anxiety. In fact, one of the advantages that many men develop with age when they are emotionally and physically healthy is patience. A slower, more attentive, more responsive form of intimacy that is based on awareness rather than urgency. This kind of presence is often experienced as more meaningful because it is less focused on outcome and more focused on connection. And connection is what the nervous system actually responds to most deeply. When a man is fully present, attentive, and responsive to his partner's experience without distraction or internal performance pressure, it creates a sense of being seen. And that experience of being seen is one of the strongest emotional foundations for intimacy. Now, let us connect physical vitality back to everything we have discussed so far. Embodied certainty, emotional availability, purpose, and physical vitality are not separate traits operating independently. They reinforce each other. A man who is physically engaged is more likely to feel emotionally grounded. A man who has purpose tends to care more about his physical state. A man who is emotionally available is more likely to be present in his body rather than disconnected from it. And a man who carries embodied certainty is less likely to neglect his physical presence because he is no longer operating from insecurity. When these elements begin to align, something important happens. The man becomes internally consistent. And internal consistency is one of the most powerful forms of attractiveness that exists because it removes confusion from interaction. People do not need to guess where they stand. They do not need to interpret contradictions between words, behavior, and energy. What they experience is coherence. And coherence creates trust at a very deep level. Now, it is also important to say this clearly. Many men over 60 already have the foundation for this, but they do not always recognize it. They underestimate the value of their presence because they are comparing themselves to a standard that no longer applies to them. They are measuring themselves against youth rather than measuring themselves against depth, stability, and lived experience. And when that comparison shifts, the entire self-perception shifts. Because the real question is not how do I look compared to a younger man. The real question is what kind of presence do I offer as the man I am today? And when that question is answered honestly, the result is often far more powerful than most men expect. Now we bring everything together, because none of what we have discussed actually works in isolation. Embodied certainty, emotional availability, purposeful living, and physical vitality are not separate concepts that you pick and choose from. They form a single integrated way of being. And when they come together in a man over 60, something very important happens in how he is perceived, experienced, and emotionally received by others. At this point, we are no longer talking about superficial attraction. We are talking about presence that is felt at a nervous system level. The kind of presence that does not need to announce itself because it is already communicating through consistency, stability, and coherence. Let us be clear about what that means. A man with embodied certainty is no longer negotiating his identity in every interaction. He is not seeking approval through performance or adjustment. He is grounded in what he knows about himself, shaped by decades of lived experience. He is not rigid, but he is not lost either. There is a settled quality to him. When emotional availability is added to that foundation, the man is no longer just stable, he is also accessible. He can speak about his internal world without distortion. He can acknowledge emotion without becoming overwhelmed by it. He can listen without defensiveness and respond without avoidance. This creates a level of relational safety that is immediately felt, even if it is not consciously analyzed. Then comes purpose. A man who is still engaged with life, still curious, still building, still learning, still contributing in some meaningful way, carries a different kind of energy entirely. He is not dependent on others to give his life structure or meaning. He already has direction, and this changes the entire relational dynamic from need to invitation. And finally, physical vitality completes the picture. Not as youthfulness, but as energy in motion. The way he moves, the way he carries himself, the way he respects his body and maintains his presence in it. This signals that he is still actively participating in life, not withdrawing from it. When all of these elements are present together, the result is not just attractiveness in the conventional sense. It is something deeper. It is coherence. Coherence means that what a man thinks, feels, says, and does are not in conflict with each other. There is no fragmentation in how he presents himself, no hidden contradiction that others have to decode. What you see is what you get, and what you get is stable, aware, and alive. From a psychological standpoint, coherence reduces cognitive and emotional load for the people interacting with him. There is less uncertainty, less internal scanning for hidden signals, less emotional guessing. And when that internal noise decreases, something very important happens. The body relaxes. And when the body relaxes, connection becomes possible. This is where attraction operates at its most authentic level. Not through effort, not through strategy, but through felt experience. A sense that being in this person's presence is steady, open, and real. Now, it is important to address the central misunderstanding that many men over 60 carry, the belief that they are somehow past their most attractive phase, that they are competing against younger versions of themselves or younger men in general. That entire framework is based on a misunderstanding of how human attraction actually develops in mature relationships. Attraction is not a single fixed standard that peaks and then declines uniformly. It is a shifting set of responses based on emotional safety, psychological depth, and relational experience. And in that landscape, a man who has lived fully, who has developed self-awareness, who has integrated his emotional world rather than suppressing it, and who still remains engaged with life, is not at a disadvantage. He is in a different category entirely, but only if he stops trying to erase his age instead of inhabiting it. Because the real issue is not age. The real issue is rejection of age, the refusal to fully occupy the person one has become. When a man apologizes for his experience, minimizes his presence, or tries to imitate a version of himself that no longer exists, he disconnects from the very qualities that create depth. But when he accepts his history, his growth, his losses, his learning, and allows those experiences to shape how he shows up in the present, something shifts. He becomes anchored. And anchoring is what people feel as presence. Now, let us be direct about what this means in real life. Women, particularly women who have developed emotional intelligence through their own experiences, are not primarily responding to surface traits at this stage of life. They are responding to emotional reality, to consistency, to depth that is not performed, to strength that is not defensive, to openness that is not fragile. They are responding to men who are fully there, not partially present, not performing relevance, not chasing validation, but actually there in their body, in their awareness, in their life. And that is rare. Not because it is impossible, but because most men never fully learn how to integrate all of these elements together. They develop parts of themselves, but not the whole system. Or they abandon parts of themselves in order to conform to expectations that no longer serve them. So when a man does integrate them, when he becomes emotionally open without losing stability, purposeful without becoming rigid, physically engaged without obsessing over youth, and confident without needing external validation, something changes in how he is experienced. He becomes memorable, not in a loud or attention seeking way, but in a lasting way. Because people do not forget coherence. They may forget words, they may forget details, but they do not forget how their nervous system felt in someone's presence. And presence like that is not about trying harder. It is about no longer abandoning yourself in the ways you used to. So if there is one thing to take from all of this, it is this. You are not becoming less relevant with age. You are becoming more defined. And the question is not whether attraction is still available to you. The question is whether you are willing to fully inhabit the version of yourself that life has already built. Because when you do, you are no longer trying to be attractive. You simply are.